Okay, so hello everybody. I think we're ready to get started here. Thanks for joining us today for another exciting ProcessMaker webinar. I'm Giovanni Lopez. You probably remember me from past webinars. And today I'm more than glad about presenting Mr. Taylor Dondich, ProcessMaker CTO here, who's going to provide us with all of the details about the alpha release of ProcessMaker IO. So ProcessMaker IO is a highly scalable, highly resilient workflow engine that's offered as a cloud microservice for ISVs and developers. So today we will be discussing how next generation CRMs, ERPs, DMS, IoTs, and so on can leverage the power of ProcessMaker IO inside their products, as well as the roadmap for ProcessMaker IO, service levels, and current SDK support. Well, I think that's enough of introduction. Let me pass controls to my dear friend Taylor, and let's begin with the presentation.
Thanks, Giovanni, for that intro. Again, as mentioned, I'm the CTO here at ProcessMaker. I just wanted to say I joined ProcessMaker in 2016. Very excited to be here with this great company. ProcessMaker IO is really one of the first major projects that kind of came out in the last year. We're in public alpha right now. And now it's a good time as any to kind of go over in a brief introduction of what the project is all about and how it can present value to you. There's my ugly mug, but also my email address. So if we don't get a chance to answer your question, feel free to email me at any time. My email address is taylor@processmaker.com. More than happy to talk to you more about the project and answer any questions that may not be answered during this webinar. There's also my Twitter handle in case you want to publicly abuse me. More than happy to have a public conversation about the project as well. And then there's also my LinkedIn. Also, really briefly going about ProcessMaker, we're a global company, quite a few people working with us, a great group of people. But really what I wanted to mention is over the years, we have had a global collection of customers. As you can see, we have quite a few customers around the world. We can see some banks there, financial institutions. We can see some education companies. And when dealing with all these customers, they all have the same problem once they grow to a certain level. There's a collection of processes internally, whether they're employee onboarding, credit checks, financial processes of the like. Those are all internal processes, right? These are processes that are happening inside the organization. And we've been able to satisfy these customers by using our main product, ProcessMaker BPM, as the entire BPM suite. ProcessMaker BPM includes everything from a process designer, forms, UI, rich reporting. And again, this was really meant for organizations that had internal processes. So they would log into our product, see our UI, and then be able to interact with the processes, fire them off, move processes forward using all those tools that we made available to them. But there was another market that pretty much presented itself. If you were a vendor that provided services to a customer, maybe those customers wanted you to do some additional workflow that isn't necessarily in your wheelhouse. So these are not internal processes, but external processes that are driven by your customer actions. So what we want to do is solve that problem, right? So as a service vendor, we all have customers. Customers are fickle creatures, and they always want to do an action, right? And then they come back a month later and say, well, I'd like to do a certain action after that action happened. But then I want to do another action, but only if something else happened previously that happened. And then now I have all these other services that I want to talk to on the internet, so we need to talk to that as well. And so these issues compound. So let's just give a really brief example, right? So let's say our company is an order fulfillment provider, right? And generally, customer wants to do this. Their customer wants to enter an order. You want to validate that payment is successful. Do they have enough money to pay for it? Process the payment, and then potentially deliver the items. Very, very simple, right? Not so much, because after a while, the process evolves and starts to look a little something like this, right? Highly complex, a lot of moving parts, a lot of decision making. And so the problem there is, as a service provider, you think that you can start building it in-house, right? So we'll throw a couple if and else statements in there. We'll handle all that logic. But as the customer requirements grow, that process evolves, which means all of a sudden your code, which may have been a few lines of code, has spawned to multiple thousands of lines of code, hard to maintain, hard to manage. Anytime the customer wants to make a change, it can be disastrous, right? You make one change and all of a sudden the entire process stops. Another issue with this, and we're going to continue with the order fulfillment example, is scaling, right? Custom in-house solutions, sometimes they can be brittle, or sometimes we can't expect it to grow with our growth. So with an order fulfillment company, we all know that the holidays are the most busiest time of the year. And what happens if that process breaks down during the middle of that rush? Millions of dollars can be lost. And we don't want that, right? So these are the types of problems that we want to solve with ProcessMaker IO for those service companies and for those companies that need to build software to kind of support these types of processes. So basically that problem says workflow is hard, right? We have some requirements as a ISV or as a service provider for workflow that we want to try and tackle, right? Workflows need to be dynamic. As I mentioned, customer requirements change all the time. And if you're a service provider or an ISV, you know that one customer does not equal another customer, right? Our customers all have different needs. They all have different requirements. They all have different systems that they need to talk to and orchestrate. And so we need to support workflows that are dynamic and always changing. We need to be reliable, right? As order fulfillment, the moment an order fulfillment process breaks down, that's money lost. So we need to make sure that we can be reliable and also be able to fail gracefully, right? So if a dropship provider is not responding in a timely manner, we need to be able to gracefully fail and then potentially retry. So we need the workflow to be resilient in that way. And then also the workflow needs to scale, right? So during the majority of the year when you're not processing as many orders, that's great, we're handling it, but when you start to see those peaks of usage, the workflow execution needs to scale with that. It needs to be just as fast as before, but it also needs to handle dramatically more volume. So ProcessMaker IO is a way to kind of solve that problem, right? We want you to be able to focus on your core value proposition, your core service, but then not deal with the complexities of developing the workflow, executing the workflow, and making sure that the workflow actually is resilient and scales along with your growth. So the idea is that your development team would program the workflow into the engine, and then we'd be the ones that are responsible for executing it. We could execute it tens of times, hundreds of times, thousands of times, or millions. And our system would be able to scale along with your growth. So that's really the core value proposition for ProcessMaker IO. I'm not going to get into too much technical speak. I want to kind of keep it light and brief, and then we may dive into a little bit more technical details. But just in general, if you do come from the workflow world, I do see that there are some attendees that kind of come from that space. We do speak BPM in business process modeling notation. That is a kind of a language that visually represents processes, but we use it really as a really nice roadmap for implementation. So anything that you see in the BPM in specification, we support as a workflow engine. And what that means is that the workflows that we can execute can be quite complex, right? We can have decision making, we can have parallel tasks, we can have human-based interactions. And so anything that you see in BPM in, we can also support. That also means that if you come from a workflow background, you're probably used to using various BPM in tooling, such as designers, and we can also support those tools too, so you can actually visually design your workflow and then import it. But I can't really design. I mean, these slides are probably the extent of my design capabilities. I'm a developer, and you probably have a development team that would feel more comfortable with code. And so we also support the concept of workflow as code. So you can programmatically create your workflows as well as programmatically alter those workflows through our SDKs. And so we have a wide collection of SDKs in many popular languages, more SDKs being generated. And by using those SDKs, you can programmatically create those workflows and then execute them. This is a SaaS kind of design. So we actually provide this service inside the AWS ecosystem. So we take advantage of all of the resiliency and reliability and scaling AWS provides to us, which is fantastic. But this also gives us the ability to deploy private ProcessMaker IO environments for customers that require that for compliance needs. We also built a system with this idea of isolation in mind. Even though it's a SaaS, these aren't shared resources. So when we do spawn a ProcessMaker IO workflow engine, these are isolated engine instances, which means that they can scale independently, as well as have data isolation. So the execution of processes in your workflow engine can't see or alter the data of other account engines, and vice versa. And as I mentioned, each engine can scale out on their own. So you might have a workflow engine that is responsible for your order fulfillment, which might scale at a different time, whereas you might have a workflow engine that probably is handling internal processes or simple customer management processes that can scale out differently. What's also interesting about this is that this gives you the ability to try out processes in, say, a workflow engine that is kind of designated for staging or development environment. And so obviously the scaling requirements there are dramatically lower, and then have a production environment that you can move your processes to, and then obviously that would scale up based on your production needs. So really the idea here is that you can embed all of these advanced workflow processes and all of the routing that comes with processes into any of your tooling. So if you have a CRM, ERP, CMS, SCM, or if you've built custom applications for your customers, the idea is that you can embed powerful workflow functionality into your applications without having to deal with the spaghetti code of rolling out your own. So really briefly, I'm just going to show a really simple example. Now, if anyone's coming from the workflow view, they're going to go, oh my God, this is very, very simple. But the reason why I'm showing this is that if there's any developers there who are trying to get the understanding of workflow and the foundations behind it, this is a really good example. The other reasoning is that a full in detail walkthrough for developers is available on our ProcessMaker IO blog. So an example would be if we were, a widget company and we wanted a very, very simple workflow. If somebody filled out a contact form, we would want to basically send us an email with the contents of that contact form. Again, this is a very simple workflow. There's a visual representation of that, right? We want to start the process by gathering all the fields in that form, and then we want to send that information, and then the workflow is done. But going back to that concept that customer requirements are always changing, say for example, well, now they want to talk to MailChimp and make sure that we add their email address to our mailing list. Oh, and also we want to file a ticket in Zendesk. And also we want a notification in Slack. All of a sudden the requirements start to get more complex. So you can use this simple workflow as kind of a building foundation for building something more complex for customer interaction. So all of our code is available on GitHub, which I'll show in just a moment. But here is ProcessMaker IO's website. This is currently available. You can take a look at it, create an account. I'm already logged in, but registering is very, very quick. There is no cost. You don't even have to put in your billing information. Go ahead and sign up, get started, and play around with it. And that's available for our alpha. Here is my instances, which are my workflow engines. And by clicking Create Instance, dynamically, automatically, I am creating a workflow engine. Now, talking about that isolation, these are completely isolated environments, which means that API endpoints are all unique to the workflow engine. The data is stored in its own engine. I already have an existing instance here. The one that I just created just fired up and is ready to go. But these instances have their own API endpoints, which we can see here, and again, its own data set. So its own collection of users, and its own collection of processes that aren't visible to other workflow engines in the system. Also on the ProcessMaker IO website, we have some additional links, which I'll go over really briefly after the demo. But going really quick to the GitHub repository, which I'll share a link at the end. This is available in GitHub. The example, the developer walkthrough code is all available, but we can show real quickly that you can go to the GitHub repository, and there is code here which creates our process. This is about 100 lines of code, and like I said, this lays out the foundation, but as you add more complexity, you'll start to see the code savings that goes into it, because this is a very easy, fluent, programmable interface to creating workflows as code, as well as, again, you can use popular BPM and diagramming tools if you want, but here I'm just showing some example code. If we go through here, I'm not going to go into detail, but programming schematically, I'm creating the process, and I'm basically creating the steps of how to gather the data, send out the email, and execute it. And then if I actually build a form, this is a simple HTML form, and I can fill it out, we will see that it calls our engine. And I'm just going to fill out some details here. 125, 500 uni widgets. Please contact me. This form is talking to our engine and executing that process. If you look at the URL here, I'm not loading this on a server. I'm loading this in just an HTML form. There's no intermediate server required, right? You don't even have to run your own server in order to communicate to our engine. The idea of serverless compute, very, very fancy, very popular these days, but we make it a reality, right? So we can handle the compute of your workflow, even if there is advanced computing requirements in there. So for example, if you need to do some calculations in your workflow, we can handle that through scripting. But you don't necessarily need your own server in order to interact with your engine. So we can see that just by submitting this form, talk to our engine, it fired off that very simple process. I got a success here. And then if I look through my email, I'll get a contact form, and then I got my email. Very, very simple. I wanted to go over it very, very briefly. But if you go to our ProcessMaker blog at blog.ProcessMaker IO, you'll get a very, very detailed walkthrough of how that process was developed, some of the core concepts behind ProcessMaker IO from a developer perspective, and kind of how to roll out your own example. Okay. Going back to our ProcessMaker IO website, if you wanted to know a little bit more about use cases which are more complex, there is a use cases link and video walkthroughs that go through it. I talked really briefly about the idea of maybe communicating with Slack or MailChimp. Those examples are here. How to potentially integrate with a CRM. That use case is here. And we go through the entire walkthrough. We walk through the example of creating the process, how somebody would execute it, and we even give you the code so that you can get started. There's also very rich API documentation. Just mentioning before, we have SDKs in popular languages, Java, PHP, Python, Perl, C#. We have additional languages coming soon, which I'll talk about. But through this documentation, you can see all the API endpoints and how to create processes, how to execute them, and also how to get the current status of executing processes as well. Just again, the use cases that we have examples for NDA signing with Google Docs, how to integrate with Google Docs. That also shows how to use roll out your own forms or potentially use a form provider like Google Forms. Email sending with MailChimp, how to interact with either your own SMTP server or perhaps with a mail provider such as MailChimp. Embedding into CRMs, potentially interacting with communication systems. There's an example that integrates with Slack. We have more use cases coming along. And so if you do have an idea on potentially a use case that would show a lot of value, by all means, send it over to me. We'll be more than happy to develop an example just to show you how easily you can integrate with another system. Again, this is free for you to try out. You can sign up, create an account, fire off your own workflow engines. This is free to play for now. We're currently in a public alpha. We want to see what you build. We want to see what you develop, any interesting concepts, and also for you to give us a lot of feedback. We're very open to understanding where you might want to see some additional features, and also how we can improve the system. So when we start fleshing that out, you will see more pricing information coming soon, but I definitely would urge you to sign up, give it a shot, let us know. We're very open to candid feedback. Again, there's a lot of documentation online. We have documentation for our API. And again, our API can be used by the SDKs, but it's also a RESTful API. So if you have your own HTTP client that you want to use, we do have REST API endpoints. There's documentation on the use cases that I talked about, and also our ProcessMaker IO blog. The developer walkthrough that I mentioned is published there. That's going to be the first in a series of developer walkthroughs. And as we release each new blog post, it will introduce more complex concepts to developers who are not potentially familiar with workflow concepts, so that you can understand it, and also just to see additional value as you begin to make your processes more complex. Talking about the roadmap for ProcessMaker IO, like I said, we're in public alpha, which gives us all the core basic functionality of workflow execution. But as we approach our beta stage, there's going to be some additional features that we add. Right now, we're working on real-time audit logs. So you may want to know precisely what is occurring in the execution of your workflow. And so we want to be able to present that information to you, not in a canned daily format, but in real time. And then we want to be able to provide cumulative stats. So if, for example, you want to see how many process executions happened in the last hour, what type of processes, we're going to provide that functionality for you in a very clear audit log API. We have some additional SDKs coming through the pipeline. We will be supporting Golang, as well as JavaScript, ES6, and Node.js support. I did mention really briefly that you can do advanced computation inside your workflow execution. Currently, we can support Lua scripting inside your workflow. However, we can also support Node.js coming up soon as an option for script tasks. If that concept is a little unfamiliar to you, AWS has AWS Lambda. That is another example of serverless execution. However, we also are going to be supporting Node.js script execution and Lua script execution. So if you want to hand that computation off to us, we'll be able to support that. Also, we will be releasing an open source visual process designer. So this will be an open source designer that you can download and use to design your own processes, but also more importantly, you can use that as a foundation to create your own process designer that fits the needs of your customer. As I mentioned, every customer is different and they have different concepts of workflow, right? They might want to just see something that is more sequential in flow, or you might have your power user customers that need something a little bit more complex. This open source foundation will give you the ability to create something custom that is perfectly embeddable into your application. We talked about workflow as code. So obviously you saw really quickly the idea of programmatically creating your processes. There's also the concept of BPMN diagrams that you can import, but also we want to support the idea of describing processes in YAML. YAML is a very popular description language that are used by developers currently and by DevOps teams, and of course we want to satisfy those people, so we will support YAML as a descriptive language for processes. And also we'll be releasing out more and more connectors. I talked briefly like we have connections to Google Docs, Slack, MailChimp, etc., but we want to grow this. And by all means, if you have a question of, hey, can you support talking to this platform or that platform, please send it over to us. We will use that as a roadmap for the development of our connectors. That's everything from my end. Again, this is my email address, taylor@processmaker.com. These are some links, obviously, to the ProcessMaker IO website and to the blog, and then also to our GitHub. I'm now going to hand it over to Giovanni, and then we'll just answer any questions that have come up.
Okay, thanks Taylor for that great presentation. So everything about ProcessMaker IO looks pretty awesome at this point. Now we're open to receive any question or inquiry you may have. You can use the GoToWebinar Q&A interface to send all of your inquiries and all of your questions. Okay, so we have the first question here. Taylor, if you can help us with this one. Is ProcessMaker IO available for public usage?
So again, we are in public alpha right now, so you can definitely go to our website, ProcessMaker.io, to go ahead and sign up for a free account. There is no account wait period or anything like that. You just have to validate your email. But the moment you get your account, you can fire up a workflow engine. As you saw, it takes just a matter of seconds for a new engine to fire up, which will immediately give you an API endpoint to use and get started. And you know, there's no limitations right now to the usage of the system. We definitely want to see you use it heavily, create complex processes, execute them, give it a shot, give it a trial. Do remember we are in public alpha. I do want to mention, you know, we may continue to evolve the product during the alpha stage, so please don't use it for production work use cases right now, but do realize that the system will become more stable over time with new additional features, which will make it production ready. Right now, we just want people to kick the tires and tell us what they think. As the product evolves, then we might start releasing pricing information. Really briefly, the pricing is going to be related to, you know, process execution, how complex your processes are. Pretty, you know, familiar pricing format. But until then, you know, by all means, sign up, get started.
Great. We have another question here, which reads, where can I download or access to ProcessMaker IO?
So ProcessMaker.io is the website. There is nothing that you have to necessarily download. Like I said, this is a SaaS platform. We execute everything on our side. but you can download any of the SDKs if you want to use SDKs. Again, you don't necessarily have to. There's a full RESTful API that you can communicate with directly. All the API documentation goes over the REST API endpoints as well as the responses. But beyond that, there's nothing that you have to download. There's no engine that you have to download. Everything runs inside the cloud.
Okay, we have another question from Robert. Thanks for joining us today, Robert. He's asking how many instances I can create with my account.
So we do have a limit right now of 20, which is quite a bit. But we can, that is just a limit that we've imposed in our system. However, we can increase that for anyone. Like I said, you might fire off a workflow instance that resembles maybe your developer workflow, where you have one where it's for development, one for staging, one for production, or you might have a workflow engine which is specific to organizational units in your organization. The numbers can vary. Again, that was an arbitrary limit that we imposed. If you need that increased, by all means, email us and we'll change it for you.
Okay, another question from Matt here, who's asking, where is the open source workflow engine available?
So if you're interested in an open source workflow engine that is quite capable and powerful, by all means, we would say, take a look at our ProcessMaker BPM product that is fully open source, very powerful workflow engine that you can run locally. Again, that is ProcessMaker BPM, which is meant to be an entire BPM suite for local organizations. This is really meant to be something where you don't have to necessarily worry about running it on premise and all the complexities there. Obviously, as you grow, running this type of workflow environment locally also requires a lot of hand-holding and maintenance. So that's one of the reasons why we want to make sure that this was a service that was provided for us. We handle all the infrastructure management, things like that. But we do understand that there is a requirement for on-premise customers as well. This might be data privacy issues and things like that. So one of the things I didn't mention on our roadmap, but one of the things that we are building is the ability to run local execution agents inside your infrastructure, so that this is basically a pool only. You're not pushing any of your information to our cloud, but basically you're pulling in process definitions and workloads to an agent that runs locally in your infrastructure. That way, any of the execution steps run locally. You have data isolation inside your corporate network, and so that's something that we'll make available in our roadmap that is downloadable and you can run internally inside your organization.
Great. A question from our dear friend John. I heard something about a hackathon. Can you tell me more about it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. If you do go to our ProcessMaker IO website, you're going to see a banner at the top. We do have a public hackathon going right now, and we will be announcing the winners at the All Things Open conference later this month. Very exciting hackathon. You have a chance to win some really great prizes, including an iPhone X. The idea behind this hackathon is, again, sign up, build something awesome. Show us what you can do, and also show us, what we can improve. And we will announce the winners. These are projects which, can be goofy, can be amazing, can be awesome, can be useful. It can be something that executes a process, or maybe a designer. Anything that's related to ProcessMaker IO, we want to see it. So by all means, go to the main ProcessMaker IO website. You're going to see a link to the hackathon at the top. This is free for anyone to go ahead and enroll, try it out, and also possibly get rewarding visibility about what you built.
That sounds great, Taylor. Another question here, what's the best way to start working with ProcessMaker IO?
Okay, I've mentioned a lot of resources, and sometimes it could be overwhelming. We do have, obviously, the ProcessMaker IO website. When you do log in or visit that website, you're going to see some links at the top, right? So there's going to be a link for use cases that's going to go over all the use cases I talked about and show some examples of talking to third-party systems. That can be a little bit overwhelming, so maybe you want to take a look at the API documentation. That's going to go through every API endpoint as well as how to use it. And also take a look at our ProcessMaker blog. That's going to have some topics on ProcessMaker IO, but more importantly, developer walkthroughs on how to get started. And right now we launched our first blog article that is really the introductory for developers on how to create that simple workflow that I kind of described really briefly in the webinar, but it's going to go further into detail step by step on how to do it. And then also our GitHub repository, which I also mentioned. All the code for our use cases, all the code for our SDKs, all the code for our developer walkthroughs is freely available for you to look at in GitHub, download it, take a look at it, poke at it, try it out on your own workflow engine. And that's a really good way to get started.
All right, I have a final question here. I think you mentioned something about it, Taylor. is it possible to integrate ProcessMaker IO with Slack?
Yeah. So again, the use cases are going to show examples of how we communicate to third-party systems. And one of the use cases is kind of a vacation request that is integrated into Slack. So say, for example, your entire organization is on Slack, which many organizations are now, and somebody says, hey, I'm just burned out, I need some time off. So they message a bot and say, hey, I need these days off. And then the workflow execution begins, and then it contacts maybe that person's manager and says, hey, this person requires some time off, do you approve? And then the manager can approve or reject anyway that vacation request inside Slack. So this is a workflow execution that completely happens in Slack. There's no web interface or anything like that. So this is a really good example of a different way of doing human interaction with ProcessMaker IO. And so that use case is already built. An example of that in its code and a video that shows the integration is available on the ProcessMaker IO website. As I mentioned in the roadmap, we are creating additional connectors for third-party systems. We obviously know that there's a huge ecosystem out there. There's other communication platforms, there's mail platforms, there's document platforms and everything, and we want to talk to them all. And so if you do have a priority list of saying, hey, do you talk to this or do you talk to that, please send them over to me via email. I'm more than happy to take them in, put them in our roadmap, and make sure that we support them for your needs.
All right, I think that's a wrap. Taylor, thanks for joining us today, and thanks everybody for attending today. I hope you have enjoyed this webinar as I did, and I'll see you soon in another ProcessMaker IO webinar. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.